Lillian Harper pressed her mother's last letter against her chest and stepped off the stagecoach into a town that had never once been kind to a woman who looked like her. The whispers started before her boots hit the dirt, but she didn't flinch. She had survived worse than whispers. She had survived a lifetime of being told she was not enough, and she had made herself a promise that she would never believe it again. If you've ever been overlooked by the people who should have seen you, clearly, this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel, follow Lillian's journey all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The stagecoach from Cheyenne pulled into Red Hollow, Wyoming, just after noon on the hottest Tuesday in the summer of 1883, and the driver didn't even wait for the dust to settle before he was reaching for the luggage rack. "End of the line, miss," he said, not looking down at her. Lillian Harper descended the iron steps slowly, her traveling bag in one hand, a worn leather satchel in the other. She was 24 years old, with chestnut hair pulled back in a low braid, pale blue eyes that didn't miss much, and a figure that had caused strangers to speak about her as though she couldn't hear. She was a large woman, full-bodied and solid in a way that polite society in 1883 had no polite language for. She had learned long ago that most people saw her body before they saw her face before they heard her name, and her name before they bothered to learn anything real about her. She set her bag on the ground and looked up at Red Hollow. It wasn't much. A main street with a general store, a church with a leaning steeple, a saloon that looked like it had given up trying a livery stable, and a handful of wooden buildings that the Wyoming wind had been slowly winning arguments against for years. Maybe 200 people in the whole county. Maybe fewer who would matter. A group of women stood near the general store porch. They were watching her the way women in small towns watched strangers openly without apology, with the quiet certainty of people who believed they were the measure of what was acceptable. One of them leaned toward another and said not quietly enough, "Lord above." Callahan finally placed that advertisement, and that's what answered it. Low laughter, the kind that was meant to carry. Lillian looked at them directly. She did not smile. She did not look away. She held eye contact for exactly as long as it took for the woman who had spoken to glance down at the porch boards beneath her feet. Then Lillian picked up her bag and looked for the liveryman. A boy of about 12 came running from the direction of the stable, nearly tripping over his own feet, and skidded to a stop in front of her. He had a gap-toothed grin and the permanent squint of someone who spent most of his life outdoors. "You Miss Harper," he said. "I am. Mr. Callahan sent me. I'm Tommy. I'm supposed to take you out to the ranch." He looked at her bag, then at her satchel, and made a quick calculation. "I can take one of those. I'll carry both," she said. "Lead the way, Tommy." He turned and started walking toward a wagon tied at the far end of the street. Lillian followed him, and she was aware in the way that a person becomes very aware when they have had years of practice that the entire main street of Red Hollow was watching her go. She heard another voice behind her. A man this time. Older, with the carrying laugh of someone who considered himself an authority. Wyatt Callahan's finally lost his mind entirely, bringing in a woman built like a draft horse to run a cattle ranch. More laughter. Lillian kept walking. Her jaw was tight. Her spine was straight. She focused on Tommy's dusty boots ahead of her and on the mountains in the distance that she hadn't expected to find beautiful, and did. She was not here because she had wanted to come. She was here because the alternative was worse. Her mother had died in April. They had lived together in a single room above a laundry in Cheyenne, and her mother had worked that laundry for 11 years, until her hands couldn't anymore, and then her lungs followed shortly after. The room had gone back to the landlord within a week of the funeral, and the job her mother had held had gone to a younger woman by the following Monday. Lillian had had $37 a bag of clothes, her mother's Bible, and the particular kind of calm that comes to a person who has cried every possible tear and come out the other side of it into something harder and quieter. She had seen the advertisement in the Cheyenne paper, seeking a capable woman for domestic and ranch management duties. Callahan Ranch, Red Hollow, Wyoming. Compensation and housing provided. No romantics required. Inquire directly, Wyatt Callahan, She had stared at those last 3 words for a long time. No romantics required. It was the most honest advertisement she had ever seen a man place, and she had respected it immediately. She did not want romance. She did not want to be evaluated as a prospect. She wanted work and shelter and the right to make herself useful without anyone deciding beforehand that she was not capable of it. She had written back that same day. She had told him she could cook, manage accounts, handle animals, and work from sunup to dark. She had not told him her age, and she had not described herself. If he asked, she would tell the truth. But she saw no reason to give him the information that the rest of the world always used against her before she had the chance to prove a single thing. He had written back in 4 days. "Come on the 15th. Tommy Briggs will meet you." That was the entire letter. She had found it somehow the most reassuring thing she'd read in months. The Callahan Ranch sat about 4 miles outside of Red Hollow, at the base of a long, gradual slope that ran up toward a ridge of pine-covered hills. The drive out was quiet, except for the creak of the wagon and Tommy's occasional commentary about local landmarks, which he offered with the solemnity of a much older person. "That's the Hendersons' place," he said, pointing at a prosperous-looking spread with a white fence. "Mr. Henderson says Mr. Callahan made a mistake not selling last year when the price was high." He paused. "Mr. Callahan doesn't sell." "Is that right?" Lillian said. "Yes, ma'am. My pa says Callahan men don't sell. They die on the land, or they save it." He considered this. "My pa also says that's a real romantic way to go broke." Despite everything, Lillian almost smiled. "What do you say?" she asked. Tommy thought about it seriously. "I think Mr. Callahan just doesn't know how to give up. And I think sometimes that looks like stubbornness, and sometimes it looks like the best thing a man can do." "How old are you, Tommy?" 12, ma'am." "You're going to be a wise man someday." He grinned the gap-toothed grin again. "That's what my mama says, too." She saw the ranch before she expected to. It came into view around a long bend in the road, not grand, not crumbling, but somewhere in between. The main house was 2 stories, timber-framed, with a wide porch that had seen better days. There was a barn, a bunkhouse, a smokehouse, a chicken coop that leaned slightly to the east, and a series of corrals. Beyond the corrals, the land opened up into range grass that had gone pale and brittle from the heat. There were cattle in the far field, not as many as there should have been. Lillian looked at the grass. She looked at the water trough near the nearest corral. She looked at the state of the fencing along the south side of the property. She was already adding things up. Tommy pulled the wagon around to the front of the house and set the brake, and she was just stepping down when the front door opened. Wyatt Callahan was not what she had constructed in her mind. She had imagined someone older. Something about the terse quality of his letter had suggested a man past 60 who had become economical with words through sheer exhaustion of using them. But the man who came off the porch was perhaps 38, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark brown hair beneath a worn cowboy hat, and the kind of deep-set blue eyes that had logged more hard years than easy ones. His face wasn't cruel, nothing like that, but it had the look of a man who had made his peace with solitude and wasn't sure he wanted that peace disturbed. He looked at her. Not the way men usually looked at her, with that particular mixture of dismissal and discomfort. She had memorized the way other people memorize weather patterns. He looked at her the way she had looked at the ranch, adding things up. "Miss Harper," he said. It wasn't a question. "Mr. Callahan," she said. It wasn't either. He came down off the porch steps and stopped in front of her. Up close there were calluses on his hands, and a small scar along his jaw, and the faint lines around his eyes of someone who had spent the better part of his life squinting at horizons. "You said in your letter you could handle animals," he said. "I can." "You said you could keep accounts." "I can. My last housekeeper walked out in March. The one before that left in November. The one before that—" He stopped. "I'll be honest with you, Miss Harper. I'm not an easy man to work for. I'm up before 4 most mornings. I expect the household to function. I don't entertain. I don't explain myself more than once. I don't tolerate dishonesty." He paused. "Are we clear?" "Very," she said. Are you clear on what I require in return? Something in his expression shifted. Not warmth exactly, but something like attention, the kind a person gives when they've been surprised. I require fair wages paid on the date agreed, she said. I require that my living quarters be my own business. I require that we are honest with one another about the state of this ranch because I can't fix problems I'm not permitted to see. She held his gaze. Are we clear? He was quiet for a moment. Tommy, he said. Sir, Tommy said from the wagon. Take Miss Harper's bags inside. Show her the south room. Yes, sir. Wyatt Callahan looked at Lillian one more time, and for just a moment she thought she saw something in the back of those blue eyes that might have been relief. Then it was gone. Supper's at 6, he said. We can discuss terms after. He turned and walked back toward the barn. The south room was small, but its own. A window that faced the hills. A bed with a quilt that smelled like cedar. A washstand and a small table and a chair. Lillian set her bags down and stood in the center of the room and breathed. She had a place to be. That was enough for now. She unpacked methodically, hanging what needed to be hung and folding what needed folding, and when she was done, she sat on the edge of the bed and opened her mother's Bible to no page in particular, and read 3 sentences and closed it again. Then she stood up, tied on her apron, and went to find the kitchen. It was worse than she'd expected, not dirty. The man was not a dirty person, but sparse and disorganized in the way of someone who ate out of necessity and had long ago stopped thinking about food as anything other than fuel. There was a good cast-iron stove that hadn't been treated as well as it deserved. There were staples, flour, salt, dried beans, some cured meat, but no system to them. Everything stuffed together without logic. There was a larder that had the bones of a once well-stocked space now mostly emptied out. Lillian took stock the way she took stock of everything. Quietly, thoroughly, without drama. She found cornmeal. She found a small quantity of good lard. She found dried herbs hung from a rafter that someone, maybe a woman, maybe a long time ago, had put there with care. She made cornbread and a pot of beans cooked with the cured meat and a side of the last of some winter-preserved vegetables she found at the back of the larder. Simple food. Honest food. The kind that kept a person going. At 6 o'clock, Wyatt Callahan came through the kitchen door and stopped. That's not what I expected, he said. I used what you had, she said. Tomorrow I'll need to make a list and get into town for supplies if that's agreeable. He sat down at the table. He didn't say grace, just picked up his fork, took a bite, and chewed in silence. She sat across from him and served herself and waited. It's good, he said finally. Not enthusiastically, just accurately. Thank you. He ate. She ate. Outside the window, the last of the daylight was going orange over the ridge. Wages, he said. I'll pay you $7 a month, room and board included. 8, she said. He looked up. I manage accounts, she said. I work animals. I do more than keep house. $8. Another silence. 7.5, he said. Done. He nodded. He went back to his food. After a moment, he said, There's a ledger on the desk in the study. I'd like you to look at it tomorrow and tell me what you think. She looked at him across the table. What I think, she repeated slowly. Yes. Not what I can tidy up, what I think. That's what I said, Miss Harper. She regarded him for a moment. All right, Mr. Callahan, I'll look at it tomorrow. He gave a short nod. They finished the meal without further conversation, which suited them both. She looked at the ledger the next morning before he came in from the first round of chores. It took her about 40 minutes to understand the full picture, and the picture was not good. The ranch had been running at a loss for 2 years. The cattle numbers were down nearly a third from what they'd been in 1880. There were 3 outstanding debts, 2 to suppliers and 1 to the Red Hollow Bank, and the note on the bank loan was due in 9 months. The summer grass was failing. The herd was producing below what it needed to. The ranch wasn't dying slowly. It was dying on a schedule. When Wyatt came into the study doorway and found her sitting at the desk with the ledger open and papers spread around her, he leaned against the frame and waited. Well, he said. You have 9 months, she said. Maybe less. The banknote. I know about the banknote. The herd is underweight. The south pasture is drying out. You're losing approximately, she checked her notation, close to $12 a month more than you're bringing in. He was quiet. You said to tell you what I think, she said. I did. I think the ranch can be saved, she said. But not the way it's being run right now. His jaw tightened. She watched it and didn't flinch. I'm not here to insult you, Mr. Callahan. I'm here because you asked for honest help. So I'm being honest. The cattle aren't being rotated properly. There's a section of fence along the east side that's keeping the herd from reaching the better grass on that slope. And the east fence has been like that for 2 years, he said. Yes, she said simply. I can see that. The silence stretched. I don't know everything about cattle, she said. I know what I've read and what I've seen. You know this land. If we put those things together, we have a better chance than if you're managing all of this alone. She paused. You didn't hire me just to cook, did you? He looked at her for a long moment. No, he said. I didn't. Then let me help properly. Something moved across his face, something careful and guarded like a man opening a door to a room he'd kept locked for a long time. All right, he said. Show me what you see. She walked the property with him that afternoon. He had not expected her to keep up. She could see that in the way he set out at a pace that wasn't quite a test, but wasn't not one either. She kept up without comment, and when she saw something she thought mattered, she said so directly and without apology. The water trough at the North Corral is that the only water source the near herd has. There's a creek about a quarter-mile east, he said. But the crossing's rough. Could you improve it? He looked in the direction of the creek. Maybe. The herd that's closest to the barn, the lead cow is favoring her right front leg. Has she been checked? He stopped. He looked at the cow she meant. His expression changed slightly, an almost imperceptible tightening around the eyes. She started that last week, he said. Has the farrier been out? Not since spring. Lillian nodded. She didn't lecture. She moved on. They walked the south pasture. She crouched down and pressed her hand into the earth and felt how dry and cracked it had become. She looked at the grass, pale brittle, not offering what the cattle needed. This section is worse than the north, she said. It's always been drier on the south side. Has it always been this dry? He didn't answer immediately. No, he said finally. The last 2 summers have been harder. She stood. Then this isn't just management, it's weather too. Yes. All right. She looked out over the land. There's still something that can be done. You're very certain of things you haven't dealt with before, he said. It wasn't hostile exactly, but it had edges. She turned and looked at him. I'm certain I can look at a problem and think through it, she said. I'm certain I can work. I'm certain that if you've spent 2 years watching this slowly fail while trying to manage it alone, having another set of eyes and hands isn't going to make it worse. She held his gaze. I'm also certain that you know I'm right, or you wouldn't have hired me the way you did. His jaw moved. His eyes stayed on hers. You always this direct, he said. You asked for honesty, she said. This is what honesty sounds like. A long pause. The hot Wyoming wind moved across the pale grass. And then very quietly, Wyatt Callahan said, Fair enough. The days that followed built a rhythm. She was up before him not to prove anything, but because her body had years of practice rising before the rest of the world demanded it. She had coffee on and the kitchen in order by the time he came in from his first check of the animals. She began reorganizing the larder. She sent a carefully written supply list into town with Tommy and negotiated with the general store owner's wife for credit terms. She was fairly certain the woman had never been asked to offer quite so plainly before. She went through the accounts again and wrote out a summary in plain language that left no room for misinterpretation. She found a better system for tracking the herd's movements and put it in front of Wyatt without ceremony at supper one evening. He looked at it for a long time. Where did you learn this? He said. I read, she said. Ranch management books. Anything I could find. Agricultural journals. My father had a small farm before he died. I learned what I could before we lost it. She paused. I've been learning how to be useful since I was 8 years old, Mr. Callahan. I just haven't always had the chance to prove it. He was quiet. He folded the paper and put it in his breast pocket. I'll try it your way with the rotation, he said. That's all I'm asking. But the town hadn't forgotten she existed. When Lillian went into Red Hollow for supplies, the following week, she felt it immediately, the quality of silence that falls when a particular person enters a room. She had lived inside that silence most of her life. She had learned to move through it without letting it slow her down. She was at the counter in the general store going over her list when the bell above the door rang and 2 women came in. She recognized one of them from her arrival, the woman on the porch who had spoken first, the one who had looked away when Lillian held her gaze. Her name, Tommy had mentioned, was Mrs. Dora Hatch, wife of the man who owned the mill. A person of consequence in Red Hollow, which in Red Hollow meant something. Mrs. Hatch took one look at Lillian and made a production of moving to a different side of the store. I heard she's been out there a whole week, Mrs. Hatch said to her companion at a volume carefully calibrated to carry. I thought she'd have been on the first stage back to wherever she came from. Poor Wyatt, said the companion. What must he have been thinking? He wasn't thinking. He was desperate. There's a difference. Lillian continued reviewing her list. The store owner, a mild-mannered man named Peters, looked at Lillian with something that might have been sympathy and might have been embarrassment on behalf of his other customers. Everything in order, Miss Harper, he said quietly. Everything's fine, Mr. Peters, she said. I'd like to add a pound of salt, please. And do you carry livestock ledger books? Second shelf, far end. Thank you. She got what she needed. She paid what was owed. She thanked Peters by name, nodded civilly at Mrs. Hatch, without giving her the satisfaction of anything more, and walked out. She let herself feel it when she was back in the wagon, the particular weight of being discussed, as though you were not present, the old familiar exhaustion of it, the anger she didn't have the luxury of showing. She sat with it for 60 seconds. She allowed it. Then she picked up the reins and drove back to the ranch because there was work to do. She was in the barn 2 mornings later, checking on the lead cow she'd noticed favoring her leg when she heard boots on the barn floor, and turned to find Wyatt standing in the entrance backlit by early morning sunlight. What are you doing? He said. Checking her leg. I thought if we caught it early. She moved aside so he could see where she'd been examining the cow's hoof. There's a stone worked in deep. I got it out, but there may be some bruising. I cleaned it and put salve on it. She should be walked, not worked for a few days. He was quiet for a moment. You do this before or after you make coffee, he said. After, she said. I have priorities. He walked to the cow and looked at the hoof himself, bending down and examining it with his hands the way a man does when he both trusts and needs to verify. He straightened up. She's been off for 2 weeks, he said. I kept meaning to get to it. You had other things to tend to. I always have other things to tend to. He said it not with self-pity, but with the flat statement of fact that was his general way of communicating. That's the problem. She looked at him. That's one of the problems, she said, but it's solvable. He turned and looked back at her, and in the early morning light of the barn, she could see that he was tired, not just from this morning, but from a long time of mornings like this one. She recognized that particular tiredness. She had worn it herself. You're going to solve it, are you? He said, not mocking, something quieter than that. I'm going to help, she said. There's a difference. He held her gaze for a moment. All right, Miss Harper, he said, and turned and walked back out into the morning. She stood in the barn with the cow for another minute, her hand resting lightly on the animal's flank, listening to the sound of his boots on the dirt outside. She was useful here. She had known she could be, but knowing it and feeling it were different things. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt it clearly and cleanly, like the first real breath after a long time in a room with no air. She went back inside and put a second pot of coffee on because she had a sense he might need it. 3 weeks in the rhythm had settled enough that it began to feel almost ordinary, which was when, as Lillian had learned from long experience, things stopped being ordinary. She was updating the accounts after supper when she heard horses on the road. 2 riders. She heard Wyatt go out and exchange words with them on the porch, and the quality of his voice changed, not heated, but the particular controlled flatness of a man keeping something in check. She stayed at the desk and didn't listen to the words, only the cadence. When the riders left and Wyatt came back inside, he stopped in the study doorway and looked at the fireplace for a long moment rather than at her. "Bank," he said. She waited. "They're sending a man out in a month to assess the herd value against the note." He paused. "If the numbers don't look better, they'll call the loan early." She set down her pen. "How much time does that give us?" she said. 4 weeks, maybe 5. She opened the ledger. "Then we'd better get clear on exactly what we're working with," she said, "because we have 4 weeks to show them something different from what they've been seeing." He came in and sat across from her, and they stayed at that desk together for 2 hours, going through numbers by lamplight, and it was the most purposeful she had felt since her mother died, and perhaps the most purposeful he had felt in longer than he would have said. Outside, the Wyoming night pressed in around the ranch house. Inside, Lillian Harper was already calculating what they needed to do. She had not come here to fail. She had done enough of that in her life to know exactly what it felt like, and this was not going to be it. She had 4 weeks. That number sat in her chest like a stone from the moment Wyatt said it, and she carried it with her the next morning when she rose before 4 and went out to look at the herd before the sun was fully up. 4 weeks for the banksman to come and see something worth keeping. She stood at the fence of the north corral and counted what she could see, and then she went back inside and counted what the ledger said, and then she sat with the difference between those 2 numbers for a long time. The herd was down. Not catastrophically, not yet, but down enough that a bank examiner looking for reasons to call a note early would find one without having to look hard. The cattle were underweight from the summer heat and the poor southern pasture. The water situation was manageable but barely. The east fence that kept the herd from the better slope grass was still broken in 2 sections she'd spotted on her walk with Wyatt, and it hadn't been repaired because Wyatt had been doing the work of 3 men alone, and there were only so many hours between dark and dark. She made a list. She made another list underneath that one. Then she made a 3rd list, which was the list of things she didn't yet know but needed to find out. When Wyatt came in from his 4 o'clock rounds and found her at the kitchen table with 3 pages covered in her close, efficient handwriting, he stopped in the doorway and looked at her the way a man looks at something unexpected. "You sleep," he said. "Some," she said. "Sit down. I want to go over something with you." He poured himself coffee and sat. He didn't argue. She had noticed that about him in the weeks she'd been here. He didn't waste words on resistance when he could see a thing was going to happen regardless. It wasn't weakness. It was a kind of economy she respected. "The herd needs weight," she said. "We have 4 weeks. That's not enough time to fix the pasture situation and see results. So we have to work with what they can access right now." She pushed the first page toward him. "The east fence, both broken sections. If we fix those, the near herd can reach the slope grass. It's better than the south pasture. Not perfect, but better." He looked at the page. "That's 2 days of fencing work. 1 if we do it together." He looked up. "I can work fence," she said before he could say anything. "I've done it before. Don't make a thing of it." He held her gaze for a moment and then looked back down at the page. "All right," he said. "What else?" "The lead cow, the one with the bruised hoof, she's improving. I want to keep her moving, but not overworked. She's your best producer. We protect her." She moved to the 2nd page. "The north trough, the fitting on the inlet pipe is loose. Water's leaking out faster than it's coming in. That's why the herd near the barn has been skittish. They're not getting enough at the trough, and they don't understand why." She looked at him directly. "When did you last check the inlet fitting?" A pause. "Spring." "It's midsummer," she said, not accusingly. "I know what season it is, Miss Harper." "I know you do. I'm pointing out that it's a 15-minute repair that's been costing you water and costing your cattle comfort for 2 months. She held his gaze steadily. That's the kind of thing I'm here to catch. He was quiet. He wrapped both hands around his mug and looked at the table for a moment. You're right, he said. Just that. No apology, no excuses. Just the plain acknowledgement of a man who was too tired and too stubborn to lie to himself. She respected that too. The bank examiner, she said. What does he care about most? Herd numbers, weight, projections for the fall sale. Then those are the 3 things we build our case around. She straightened the pages. We can't change what the land's been through, but we can show him the steps we're taking and why they'll produce results. A man who understands cattle will see the difference between a ranch that's failing and a ranch that's fighting. Wyatt looked at her. You think that'll matter to him? I think it matters more than you'd expect, she said. People see effort when they're looking for reasons to say yes, and we're going to give them reasons. He was quiet for another moment. Outside the window, the first pale line of dawn was beginning to separate sky from land. When do you want to start on the fence? He said. Today, she said. Right after breakfast. He gave a short nod and stood up. I'll get the tools, he said. The fence work was harder than she'd made it sound, and she knew it while she was saying it. The posts on the east section were old, some of them half-rotted at the base, and what had looked like 2 breaks from a distance turned out to be 4 when they got close enough to really examine it. Wyatt saw her face when they reached the second section and found the extent of the damage, and she could tell he was waiting to see what she'd do with that. She picked up a post driver and kept going. By mid-morning, her shoulders were burning and her hands were raw under her work gloves. Wyatt worked beside her without commentary, setting posts with the efficient, practiced movements of someone who had done it hundreds of times, but she noticed he had adjusted his pace, not slowing down exactly, but working in a way that meant they were staying even rather than him pulling ahead. She didn't say anything about it. Neither did he. They broke for water at noon and stood at the fence line looking out at the slope above them. It was good grass up there. You could see the difference from where they stood, greener, thicker, the kind of forage that would put weight on cattle in a hurry if they could reach it. How long has the fence been like this? She said. The first break happened in a storm last September, Wyatt said. I patched it. The patch didn't hold. Then spring got busy and... He stopped. And you were managing alone, she said. He didn't answer. Mr. Callahan, she said carefully. How long has it been since you've had reliable help out here? He was quiet long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, My brother worked with me until 1880. He went north, Montana. A pause. I had a ranch hand for most of 81. He left when I couldn't pay him what he deserved. Another pause longer. After that, I've made do. 3 years, she thought. 3 years of one man trying to hold a cattle ranch together by sheer will and running himself down in the process until the ranch started going down with him. That's too long, she said quietly. Yes, he said. It is. They went back to the fence. They got 3 of the 4 sections done before the light started to fail. Wyatt went to bring the near herd up toward the gate so they'd find the new opening in the morning, and Lillian went in to start supper. Her hands were stiff. There was a blister forming on her right palm beneath the glove. She didn't mention it. She was at the stove when she heard boots on the porch, and then the door, and then Wyatt's voice said, There's a rider coming. His tone told her something about it before she'd turned around. The rider was a man named Greer. She learned this when Wyatt came back in 10 minutes later, with the particular controlled expression she was learning to read as the face he put on when something was wrong. Bill Greer, he said. He ranches the valley north of here. He's been trying to buy me out for 3 years. What did he want tonight? To tell me he'd heard the bank was looking at the note. Wyatt set his hat on the hook by the door and stood with his back to her for a moment. He wanted to know if I'd reconsider his offer. She kept her voice even. What did you tell him? What I always tell him. Which is... He turned around. That the Callahan ranch is not for sale. She looked at him. There was something in his jaw and in his eyes that she recognized, not stubbornness, not quite. Something closer to the kind of determination that has had everything tested out of it except the thing that matters most. "Good," she said simply, and turned back to the stove. A pause behind her. "That's all you've got to say about it," he said. "That's all there is to say," she said. "You're not selling, so we make sure there's nothing to sell from under you." She stirred the pot. "Sit down. Supper's ready." He sat. She served. They ate in the particular quiet that had developed between them. Not uncomfortable, not the silence of two strangers, but the silence of two people who had been working hard in the same direction all day and didn't need to fill the air with words to know it. Then he said, "You're not what I expected, Miss Harper." She kept her eyes on her plate. "What did you expect?" "I don't know exactly. Someone who needed more." He paused, choosing. "More managing." "I've never required much managing," she said. "No," he said. "I can see that." She looked up then, and he was watching her with that careful, considering expression that had no hostility in it anymore. Something had gone out of it in the weeks since she'd arrived, some defensive held-back quality that she'd noticed on that first day, and tracked quietly as it slowly left. What was there now was something more like honest attention. "What made you answer the advertisement?" he said. It was the first personal question he had asked her. She considered how much to give him. "I needed work," she said. "And I needed a place." "That's not all of it." She looked at him steadily. "The last 3 years of working in Cheyenne, I was told every time I tried to move to a position that used my actual abilities that I wasn't suited for it. Too young, they said, or too inexperienced, or—" She stopped. She looked down at the table, and then back up at him, and she decided to be honest. "Or too large." Always with a look and a silence, and a different reason given out loud, but the look and the silence told the real reason. She held his gaze. "Your advertisement said you wanted capability and honesty. It said nothing else. That was the first time in a long time that I felt like I might be evaluated on the things that are actually mine to offer." Silence. "I read your letter 3 times, he said. She blinked. "When you responded to the advertisement," he said. "I read it 3 times. It was the clearest, most direct communication I'd received from anyone in years." He paused. "I knew before I wrote back that whoever you were worth the answer." She didn't say anything for a moment. "You didn't tell me what to expect when I arrived," she said. "No," he said. "I didn't." The town has opinions about everything," he said flatly. "I can't control what they say. I can control what happens on this ranch." She nodded once. They finished the meal. He helped her clear the table without being asked the first time he'd done that, and she didn't comment on it, just made room for him to work alongside her, and that was that. The 4th week opened badly. She found 2 calves that had failed to thrive, not dead, but weak in the way that became dead quickly if nothing was done. She pulled them into the barn before Wyatt was up and spent an hour on the first one warming it, working on getting fluids into it, doing the particular focused and unglamorous work of keeping a small and struggling thing alive. Wyatt found her there at 5 in the morning, kneeling in the hay with the second calf's head in her lap, coaxing warm water into it with a patience that comes only from caring enough to sit still that long. He stood in the barn entrance and watched. She didn't look up. "The first one is stable," she said. "This one I'm less sure about." He came and crouched beside her. He looked at the calf. He reached out and checked the animal's gum color and its eyes and the tone of its muscles with the practiced hands of a man who had done this many times. "She's fighting," he said quietly. "I know," Lillian said. "So am I." Something passed across his face. She felt it more than she saw it because she was focused on the calf, but she felt it a shift in the air beside her, the particular quality of attention that a person gives when they have seen something that matters. They stayed there together for another half-hour. The second calf made it. When it finally pulled itself up on unsteady legs and took a stumbling step toward its mother, Wyatt let out a slow breath that had a great deal more in it than just relief about the animal. "You do this all night," he said. "Most of it," she said. He stood and offered her his hand to help her up from the hay. She took it. She was stiff and tired in the bone-deep way of someone who has spent too many hours on a barn floor, and she was perfectly aware that she was not a small woman, and that being pulled to her feet was a different undertaking than it might be for others. He pulled her up without any difficulty and without making anything of it, and didn't let go of her hand right away. She looked at him. He looked at her. Then he let go and stepped back and said, "Get some breakfast. I'll watch them." She went inside. She stood at the kitchen counter for a moment before she started the coffee, not looking at anything. Just standing there with the feeling of his hand around hers, still very present, solid and warm and surprising. Then she made the coffee because there was work to do. The bank examiner arrived on a Thursday. His name was Aldous Fitch, a thin man in a city suit who arrived with a young clerk and the practiced air of someone accustomed to delivering unwelcome conclusions. He shook Wyatt's hand on the porch. He looked at the ranch with the detached evaluation of someone whose relationship to land was entirely numerical. Lillian had spent the previous 5 days preparing. She had prepared a summary document written in clear, clean language, with every number annotated and every projection explained, laying out the current state of the herd, the steps that had been taken over the last 4 weeks, the expected weight gain from the slope pasture, now that the fence was repaired, and the projected income from the fall cattle drive if the herd continued at its current improvement rate. She had also prepared herself for the moment when Fitch looked at her and decided she was not relevant. That moment came about 30 seconds after they were introduced on the porch. He looked at her, looked at Wyatt, looked back at her and said, "And this is your housekeeper." "Miss Harper manages the ranch accounts and operations," Wyatt said without inflection. Fitch's expression communicated his opinion of this without requiring words. Lillian smiled pleasantly and held out the summary document. "I thought it might save time if I put the current figures together for you," she said. "I've also included the projected outcomes over the next 6 months based on the changes we've implemented. The calculations are shown in full if you want to review the methodology." Fitch took the document. He looked at it. A pause. A longer pause. "This is..." He looked up. "You did this." "I did," she said. "It's thorough," he said in the tone of a man who had not expected to say that. "Thank you," she said. "Shall we start with the herd?" She walked him out to the north corral before he quite knew what had happened, and Wyatt came alongside her, and the clerk trailed behind, and Fitch was reading the document and trying to keep up with her pace, and by the time they reached the fence, she had established without making a point of it that she was the person who would be explaining things today. She showed him the slope pasture. She showed him the repaired fence. She showed him the lead cow recovered healthy, moving well, and explained what she'd identified and treated and why it mattered to the overall productivity of the herd. Fitch asked questions. Good questions, sharper than she'd expected. She answered them directly and completely, and when she didn't know something, she said so, and deferred to Wyatt, who answered with the plain, minimal certainty of a man who knew his land. They went through the full property in 2 hours. On the way back to the house, Fitch walked beside her and said, lowering his voice slightly, "How long have you been managing operations here?" 4 weeks, she said. He looked at her. 4 weeks. Yes. And the accounts were in this state when you arrived. They were manageable, she said. They required organization. A pause. You have a background in finance. I have a background in looking at problems clearly, she said. It applies broadly. Fitch glanced at her and then at the document in his hand. "I'll need to speak with Mr. Callahan privately before I make my determination," he said. "Of course," she said. She was in the kitchen when they talked on the porch. She did not try to hear it. She made coffee and stood at the counter and looked out the small window at the hills beyond the fence line and waited. 30 minutes later, Wyatt came into the kitchen alone. She turned around. His face was difficult to read. It was always difficult to read, but there was something different in the set of his mouth. "Well," she said. "He's extending the note," he said. 3 months. On the condition that the quarterly figures improve by 15%, she exhaled. He said... Wyatt stopped. He looked at the floor for a moment, and then he looked at her, and there was something in his expression that she had not seen before. Not relief alone. Something rawer than that. He said the operation showed clear evidence of competent management, that the plan was well documented and realistic. A pause. He asked if you'd be staying. She blinked. What did you tell him? I told him that was Miss Harper's decision to make, he said. Not mine. The kitchen was very quiet. Is it a decision you'd like me to make in a particular direction? She said carefully. He held her gaze. I'd like you to stay, he said, if you're willing. Not, I need you to stay. Not the ranch needs you. I'd like you to stay, said plainly, and said looking directly at her without looking away. She thought about the stagecoach into Red Hollow. She thought about the women on the porch. She thought about 3 years in Cheyenne being told in 100 different ways that she was not quite what was wanted. She thought about a calf pulling itself up on wobbly legs in a barn at 5 in the morning, and a hand helping her up from the hay, and a man who read her letter 3 times. All right, she said. He nodded once. Then I'll plan on it, she said. He turned toward the door and then stopped. He didn't turn back around, just stood with his hand at the doorframe. The work you did these 4 weeks, he said. The fence, the calves, the document for Fitch. He paused. I want you to know I see it. She stood very still. Thank you, she said. That matters. He stepped out. She turned back to the coffee and stood there for a moment, her hands wrapped around a mug she'd poured and forgotten about warm and full and anchoring. Done. But Red Hollow was not done with her. The following Saturday, she was in town for supplies, a regular enough occasion, now that Peters at the general store had begun setting aside certain items before she arrived, when she turned around from the counter and found herself face to face with Bill Greer. How was a large man. Not tall, but wide, with the particular kind of physical confidence that comes from decades of being the biggest person in most rooms. He had pale eyes and a salesman's mouth, and the air of someone who had learned that the world responded well to his aggression and had never been given reason to update that understanding. He looked at Lillian, the way she had been looked at her entire life, up, down, back up, and then his mouth made a small, unpleasant curve that wasn't a smile. You're the woman Callahan brought in, he said. I work for Mr. Callahan, yes, she said. Heard the bank extended the note. He said it the way a man sets down a card in a game. Won't matter much. That ranch is done. Anyone who knows the land knows it. Anyone who knows the land, she said evenly, knows the slope pasture on the east side is better than anything in the valley, which I expect is why you've been trying to buy it for 3 years. He looked at her differently then. The unpleasant curve went away. What replaced it was more wary. You've got a mouth on you, he said. I've got a mind, she said. The mouth is just how the mind gets heard. She picked up her basket. Good day, Mr. Greer. She walked past him. Her heart was going hard in her chest, not from fear, but from the aftermath of adrenaline, the particular shaking that comes after you've held your ground. She kept her face completely neutral until she was through the door of the store and into the street. Peters caught her eye through the window with an expression that was unmistakably admiring. She kept walking. That evening she told Wyatt about it. Not because she needed to, but because she had decided early on that honesty was the currency they operated on, and Greer had made a move of some kind by approaching her in town, and she thought Wyatt should know. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. He approached you directly, he said. Yes, he's never done that before. His jaw tightened just slightly. That means he's trying a new approach. He's decided talking to me directly isn't working, so he's looking for other levers. He thought I'd be a lever, she said. Yes. He looked at her. Was he right? She held his gaze. What do you think? Something that was almost a smile crossed his face, gone almost immediately, but real for the moment it was there. No, he said. I don't think he was. Then there's nothing to worry about, she said. But they were both wrong about that in the way that people are wrong when they underestimate an opponent who has more moves than he's shown yet. 3 days later, when Lillian went to the north pasture to check the herd's progress on the slope grass, she found the fence. Not broken by weather, not degraded by time. 3 sections of the newly repaired east fence cut clean through with wire cutters, the posts still standing. The wire dropped deliberately on both sides, and the cattle, she could see them from where she stood, were not on the slope. They were gone. She stood at the cut fence line and looked at the empty ground where 23 head of cattle had been the evening before, and something cold and clear settled through her. She ran back to the barn. "Wyatt," she said, and her voice was controlled, but carried something in it that made him look up immediately from what he was doing. She told him in 8 words. She watched something happen in his face that she hadn't seen before. Not anger exactly, but the convergence of everything that had been building the 3 years alone, and the bank and Greer and the fence and the cattle, all of it arriving at once. He grabbed his hat. "Stay here," he said. "No," she said. "I'm coming." He looked at her. "I found them," she said. "And I know the land now. You need me." A beat. Just one. "Come on then," he said, and they went. They rode hard. Wyatt set the pace, and Lillian matched it without complaint, her horse keeping stride with his across the dry ground north of the fence line. She had learned in the weeks since she'd arrived that the land spoke if you knew how to listen to it. The bent grass, the direction of hoofprints, the particular way cattle moved when they were being driven versus when they were wandering. She had read about it. She had watched for it. And now, riding out into the early morning with her jaw set and her eyes on the ground, she used everything she knew. "They went north," she said, pulling slightly ahead and pointing. "The prints are deep on the left side. They were pushed, not spooked. Something drove them deliberately." Wyatt looked at the ground where she pointed. He didn't argue. "Greer's north pasture is 3 miles that way," he said. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "Tommy showed me the boundary lines the second week," she said. "I asked him to." Something moved across Wyatt's face. Not quite surprise anymore. More like the continued adjustment of a man who keeps finding the territory different from his map. They rode without speaking after that, and the silence between them was not empty. It was focused. It had direction. They found the first steer 1.5 miles north, grazing alone near a dry creek bed, unbothered and unaware that it had been stolen. Wyatt cut it and turned it without slowing. 3 more were clustered near a stand of scrub brush 1/2 mile beyond. Lillian took those while he went further north, and she worked them back toward the first steer with the controlled patience she'd learned. Watching Wyatt handle animals, never rushing, never crowding, keeping herself in the right position, so the cattle moved where she needed them to go rather than where they chose. She had gotten the 4 back together and was turning them south when she heard Wyatt's voice ahead of her, not calling to the cattle, calling to a person. She rode forward. There were 2 men on horseback blocking Wyatt's path. She didn't recognize either of them, but she recognized the type, the kind of men who did jobs for employers they never named, who wore their faces like closed doors. One of them had 17 of the missing cattle behind him. The other had his hand resting near his hip in a way that was not accidental. Wyatt was very still on his horse. His voice when she reached earshot was the flattest she'd ever heard it. "Those cattle carry my brand," he said. "Can't say as I noticed," the nearer man said. "Then you're either blind or lying, and you don't look blind." The man's eyes went to Lillian as she came up alongside Wyatt. He looked at her the way Greer had looked at her in the general store, that up-and-down inventory, and he made a small sound in his throat that she felt in her back teeth. "This your woman," he said to Wyatt. "This is Miss Harper," Wyatt said. "She manages Callahan Ranch operations. You'd be well served to show her the same respect you'd show me." The man smiled. It did not reach anywhere near his eyes. "Callahan, you've lost your mind bringing a woman like that out here." Wyatt moved his horse 1 step forward. Just one. But something in the way he did it made both men's horses shift. "I'm going to take my cattle now," Wyatt said quietly. "And you're going to let me. And then you're going to go back and tell whoever sent you that the next time someone cuts my fence line, I'm riding to the county sheriff before I ride after my herd. Are we clear?" A pause. The kind that has weight in it. The first man looked at the second. Something passed between them. "Take your cattle," the first man said. The smile had gone. Wyatt turned and looked at Lillian. One look, brief and certain, that said, Get them moving." She was already turning her horse. They drove all 23 head back to the ranch in just under an hour. Neither of them spoke much on the way back. There was too much to think about, and they were both thinking it, and they had learned enough of each other's silences by now to let the thinking happen without interruption. It was only when they had the cattle back in the north corral and the gate secured that Wyatt climbed down from his horse and stood for a moment with his hands on the fence rail and his head slightly bowed, and Lillian understood that the controlled flatness of the last 2 hours had been costing him something. "He's escalating," she said. "Yes," Wyatt said. He didn't lift his head. "This won't be the last move." "No." "Then we need to be ahead of him," she said, not behind him reacting. He raised his head then and looked at her. The morning light was full now, and it showed everything: the tiredness, the anger. And underneath both of those things, something that she had been watching develop slowly for weeks, and that she didn't have a name for yet, but that looked very much like the earliest form of trust. "What are you thinking?" he said. "I'm thinking we go see the sheriff today," she said. "Not tomorrow. Today. We file a report on the fence and the cattle. We create a record." She met his gaze. "Greer is betting you'll handle this quietly, like you've handled everything quietly for 3 years. He's betting you're too proud to ask for help, and too isolated to have anyone to ask." She paused. "Let's show him the bet was wrong." Wyatt was quiet for a long moment. "I've never gotten along well with Sheriff Beaumont," he said. "You don't have to get along with him," she said. "You just have to give him a written account of what happened this morning and have him sign it as received." She held his gaze. "Will you do that?" He looked at her for one more moment. "Clean up and get in the wagon," he said. "We'll go afternoon." Sheriff Dale Beaumont was a heavy-set man with a large mustache and the political instincts of someone who had held an elected position in a small county long enough to understand that most problems were best resolved by waiting for them to resolve themselves. He received Wyatt and Lillian in his office with the specific kind of wariness that a man adopts when he is confronted with something he would rather not deal with, but can see he is going to have to. He looked at Lillian when they came in and said nothing. He shook Wyatt's hand and gestured at the chairs. Lillian presented the written account she had prepared on the ride into town. She had written it in the wagon with a lap desk and her good pen in the same clear and organized language she used for everything, laying out the timeline, the physical evidence, the description of the 2 men and their location relative to Greer's property line. Beaumont read it slowly. He read it again. "You're making a serious accusation here, Callahan," he said. "I'm presenting documented facts," Lillian said before Wyatt could answer. "The accusation, if any is to be made, will follow from the investigation of those facts." Beaumont looked at her over the paper. "Miss Harper manages my ranch operations," Wyatt said. "She speaks for the ranch." "Does she?" Beaumont said. "She does," Wyatt said. The words were simple. The tone closed the question. Beaumont set the paper down. He looked at the far wall for a moment, with the expression of a man doing arithmetic in his head that he doesn't enjoy. "I'll note the report," he said finally. "I'll have a word with Greer." "We'd like a copy of the report noted and signed," Lillian said, "for our records." Another look, longer this time. "All right," he said. "Give me a few minutes." They waited. He wrote. He signed 2 copies and slid them across the desk. Lillian took both, kept one, and handed the other to Wyatt. Walking back to the wagon, Wyatt was quiet until they were out of earshot of the sheriff's office, and then he said, "You said we in there." She looked at him. "When you talked to Beaumont, you said our records." She thought about it. "I did." "You meant it." She stopped walking. He stopped too. "Mr. Callahan," she said, "I have been fighting for the survival of this ranch for 4 weeks as though my own name were on the deed. I found your fence. I recovered your cattle. I documented your case. I sat across from your bank examiner and made the argument that kept this property in your hands." She held his gaze direct and completely steady. "Yes, I meant our." Something happened in his face. It wasn't dramatic. Wyatt Callahan did nothing dramatically, but it was unmistakable. It was the face of a man who has been alone long enough that hearing the word "our" from another person landed somewhere deep and unexpected, like water reaching ground that had been dry for years. He looked at her for a long moment. "Then it's our problem," he said. "All of it. Whatever Greer does next." "Agreed," she said. They walked back to the wagon. What Greer did next came from a direction neither of them expected. It was not another attack on the fence. It was not another attempt to move the cattle. It came in the form of Mrs. Dora Hatch, who arrived at the ranch on a Wednesday morning in a buggy. She drove herself wearing her best dress with the particular expression of a woman who has appointed herself to a mission. Lillian was in the kitchen when she heard the buggy. She came to the door and found Mrs. Hatch standing on the porch looking at the ranch with the evaluating eye of someone who had been sent to report on it. "Mrs. Hatch," Lillian said. "Miss Harper." The woman looked at her. There was something different from their encounters in town, less open contempt, more calculation. "I was hoping to speak with you, and with Mr. Callahan if he's available. He's in the south pasture. I can get him if your business requires it. Or you can tell me what you've come for." Mrs. Hatch stepped up onto the porch without waiting to be invited, which told Lillian a great deal about how she intended this conversation to go. "I'll come inside," Mrs. Hatch said. Lillian stepped back and let her in. She made coffee because she had been raised to make coffee, and because having something to do with her hands while Mrs. Hatch gathered herself was useful. She set the cup in front of the woman and sat across from her and waited. "There is talk in town," Mrs. Hatch said. "There is always talk in town," Lillian said. "About you and Mr. Callahan." Lillian looked at her steadily. "What kind of talk?" "The kind that concerns a woman living alone on a ranch with an unmarried man," Mrs. Hatch said. "I want you to understand that I'm not here to be unkind. I'm here because some in town feel it reflects poorly on Mr. Callahan's standing and on yours." "My standing," Lillian said. "Such as it is," Mrs. Hatch said, and something in the way she said it made clear that she considered Lillian's standing to be a very limited quantity to begin with. Lillian wrapped her hands around her own mug and breathed through the flare of anger. "Mrs. Hatch," she said, "who sent you?" The woman blinked. "I beg your pardon." "This is not a social call," Lillian said. "You have not been to this ranch since I've been here. You made your opinion of my presence clear on my first day in Red Hollow. Something has changed in the last week that made you decide to come out here with this conversation." She held the woman's gaze. "Who asked you to come?" A pause. Mrs. Hatch's chin came up. "Bill Greer mentioned husband that he had concerns." "There it is," Lillian said quietly, "about the propriety of the situation." "Mr. Greer has concerns about this ranch," Lillian said. "The propriety of my employment is not among them. He's using you, Mrs. Hatch." She kept her voice even and without malice. "He's hoping that if enough social pressure comes to bear on Mr. Callahan, he'll decide it's easier to sell than to fight." She looked at the woman across the table with something that was genuinely direct rather than hostile. "I don't think you're a cruel person. I think you came here because you were told it was the right thing to do. But you should know who's behind the message before you decide to carry it." Mrs. Hatch was quiet. The kitchen clock ticked. "That is—" Mrs. Hatch stopped. She looked at her coffee cup. She looked at the kitchen around her, clean, organized, competently managed. She looked at Lillian. "You're very certain," Mrs. Hatch said. And this time, there was something different in her tone. "I am," Lillian said. "I have been since the moment I met Bill Greer in Peter's store and watched him decide I was a weakness to exploit." She paused. "I am not a weakness, and neither is this ranch." The door opened. Wyatt came in from outside. He must have seen the buggy on his way back from the south pasture and stopped in the kitchen doorway, taking in Mrs. Hatch and Lillian at the table with the particular alertness of a man who recognizes a situation. "Mrs. Hatch," he said. Neutral. Waiting. "Mr. Callahan," she said. She stood. She looked at him and then at Lillian and then at him again. Something was working through her expression, the slow revision of a conclusion she'd come in with. I came regarding some talk in town." "I've been aware of the talk," Wyatt said. "Yes, I expect you have." She picked up her gloves from the table. I wonder if I've allowed myself to be used as a vehicle for someone else's concerns. She said it quietly, more to herself than to either of them. You wouldn't be the first, Wyatt said. She nodded once. She looked at Lillian. You run a clean kitchen, she said. It was possibly the strangest compliment Lillian had ever received, but the way it was said made it something more than it sounded. Thank you, ma'am, Lillian said. Mrs. Hatch left. When her buggy was gone, Wyatt looked at Lillian. What did you say to her? He said. The truth, she said. It tends to cover the ground faster than anything else. He was quiet for a moment. She didn't look the way she usually looks when she leaves a conversation. No, Lillian said. She didn't. What does that mean? I don't know yet, she said honestly. But I don't think it means what Greer hoped it would mean. Oh. She was right, though. Neither of them would know it for another 2 weeks. In the meantime, the ranch work went on, because the ranch work always went on. The cattle were gaining weight on the slope pasture. The trough fitting had held since she fixed it. The 2 calves from the barn were both healthy and growing fast. The accounts were not comfortable, but they were no longer hemorrhaging. She and Wyatt had developed a system not agreed upon, explicitly, just grown the way working systems grow between 2 people who pay attention. She handled the books, the supply negotiations, the household, and the documentation of everything. He handled the physical operation of the ranch, the herd management, the decisions that came from decades of understanding the land. But the line between those territories had become permeable in a way that seemed to suit them both. She asked his opinion on animal decisions. He brought account questions to her. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, they had begun talking differently from how they talked on the first day. Not just about ranch business. It started small. She mentioned her mother one evening without planning to something about a recipe, and he listened without the awkwardness that men usually brought to personal subjects. He told her one morning about his brother in Montana, why he'd left what had passed between them in the same quiet, factual way. He explained fence repairs, as though it were simply information she might find useful. She found it more than useful. She found herself thinking about him when he wasn't in the room. She did not examine this too closely. She was practical by nature, and she understood that living and working alongside a person who treated you as an equal, when you had spent most of your life being treated as less than that, created a particular kind of feeling that might or might not be its own thing, and was best left alone until she knew which. But she noticed him. She noticed the way he moved, the way he listened, the way his jaw did that thing when he was thinking through a problem. She noticed that he had begun making coffee on the mornings he was up before her, leaving it on the stove so it would be ready. She did not think he knew that she'd noticed that. She thought maybe he did. The second twist came on a Friday. She had ridden out alone to check the east fence, a habit now she went every few days to make sure it had held, and she was halfway along the line when her horse stopped hard, and she saw why. There was a man on foot on the other side of the fence on Callahan land. Not Greer's men. Not a cowhand. He was older, thin, with a surveyor's case over his shoulder and a county seal on the badge pinned to his vest. She pulled up. "Morning," she said, and kept her voice perfectly even. "This is private property. Can I ask your business?" The man looked up. He had the apologetic eyes of someone who knew what he was doing was going to be unpopular. "Thomas Reeves," he said, "County Surveyor. I've been engaged to resurvey the eastern boundary of the Callahan property." He paused. "At the request of Mr. William Greer." Everything in her went still. "On what grounds?" she said. "There's a dispute regarding the original boundary markers placed in 1871, Reeves said. He genuinely did look apologetic. "Mr. Greer filed a formal claim with the county last week, suggesting the markers were placed incorrectly and that the actual boundary runs approximately 200 yards west of the current fence line. 200 yards west." She looked at where she was standing. She looked at the fence line. She looked at the slope pasture, the grass, that had been saving their cattle for the last month. If the boundary moved 200 yards west, the slope pasture went with it. "Has the county accepted the claim?" she said. "It's under review," Reeves said carefully. "And the survey hasn't been ordered. I've been asked to conduct a preliminary assessment. I have the authority under county ordinance to do that." He looked genuinely uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, miss. I'm just doing my job." "I understand that," she said. "Will you tell me when you plan to conduct the full survey?" 10 days, he said. "I'll post the notice with the county clerk." "Thank you, Mr. Reeves," she said. She turned her horse and rode back to the ranch at a pace she allowed herself only when no one was watching, and she was in the barn and off her horse before Wyatt saw her from the porch and understood from the set of her back that something had happened. He met her in the barn doorway. She told him. All of it in order, clearly, without catastrophizing. She had learned that the clearest way to be useful in a crisis was not to perform the crisis, but to explain it. When she finished, Wyatt said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "The original survey." "Yes. If those boundary markers were correct in 1871, then his claim fails. But if they can't be located or verified, then it goes to a legal dispute," he said. "Yes." He turned and walked to the fence rail and stood with his hands on it, his back to her. "My father filed the original deed," he said. "There would have been a survey document. Land office in Cheyenne. Would it specify the marker locations?" "It should." She came and stood beside him, not quite at his shoulder. "Then that's where we go," she said. "We get the original survey document from the land office. We have the markers found and verified. We give Reeves nothing to dispute." "That's 2 days' ride to Cheyenne and back," he said. "I know." He turned and looked at her. "I'll go," she said. "You need to stay with the herd. You can't leave the ranch right now. I can make the ride." "You'd go to Cheyenne alone," he said. "I've lived alone in Cheyenne for 3 years," she said. "I know where the land office is. I know what to ask for. I know how to navigate a bureaucratic archive." She held his gaze. "Mr. Callahan, the question isn't whether I can do this. The question is whether you trust me to." He looked at her. It was a different look from any he'd given her before. Not the adding up look from the first day. Not the careful, guarded attention of the weeks that followed. Something had opened further in him, and she could see all the way into it now, or as far as she had the right to see. "I trust you," he said. Simple, direct, the way he said everything that mattered. She breathed. "I'll leave in the morning," she said. "I'll be back in 4 days." He nodded. She turned to go back to the house to prepare, and he said quietly, "Her name, not Miss Harper, just her name. Lillian," and she stopped. "Be careful," he said. She looked at him over her shoulder. "I will," she said. She went inside. She did not let herself examine the feeling that her name and his voice had produced. She had a document to locate and a ranch to protect, and 4 days of riding ahead of her, and she was a practical woman with a clear head and important work to do. But she heard it. She heard it clearly all the way to her bones. She made Cheyenne in a day and a half, riding steadily and stopping only when she had to. She found the land office on its familiar street and stood in its familiar line and waited with the patience of someone who had spent years learning to be patient in rooms full of people who thought their time was more important than hers. The clerk who received her was young and had the particular combination of bureaucratic self-importance and inexperience that made such people both annoying and manageable. "I need the original survey document for the Callahan property in Red Hollow, Wyoming," she said. "Filed approximately 1871. The deed holder would have been James Callahan." He looked at her. He looked at the form she'd filled out. He looked at her again. "You have authority to request this," he said. "I am Miss Lillian Harper, Operations Manager for Callahan Ranch," she said. "Here is a signed letter of authorization from Mr. Wyatt Callahan, current deed holder." She placed the letter on the counter. She had asked him to write it the evening before she left. He had written it without question. The clerk took the letter. He read it. He went to find the archive. He came back 40 minutes later with a folder. She opened it at the counter and read it with her heart going fast and her face giving nothing away. The original survey document was there. Dated 1871. Signed by the county's original surveyor. And it contained something she had hoped to find, but hadn't been certain of a detailed written description of each boundary marker's location tied to specific natural landmarks that had been noted and named. She read it 3 times. Then she took out her pen and copied every relevant section in full precisely, without missing a word. She was back on the road to Red Hollow by mid-morning. She rode into the ranch on the 4th day, just before supper, tired in a way that went all the way to the marrow, her horse's hooves raising dust in the yard, and Wyatt was off the porch and at her horse's head before she'd fully stopped. "You found it," he said. He could see it in her face. "I found it," she said. He helped her down, not because she needed it, but because he was there, and it was offered, and she was tired enough to take it. She was aware, as she had been in the barn with the calf of his hands, and of how little ceremony he made of helping her. She stood in the yard and pulled the copied document from her saddlebag and handed it to him. He read it. She watched him read it. When he looked up, something was different in his face. "The markers are tied to the creek bend," he said, "and the old cottonwood," she said, "both of which are still there. I checked the description against what I know of the property. The markers, if we can find them, should confirm that the eastern boundary is exactly where the fence currently stands." She paused. 200 yards east of where Greer wants the county to put it. Wyatt looked at the document. He looked at her. "You rode to Cheyenne and back in 4 days," he said. "The horse needed the exercise," she said. His mouth moved. It was brief. It was real. "Come inside," he said. "There's supper on." She stopped. "You made supper," she said. "I've made supper before," he said. "Not since I've been here." "Well?" He walked toward the porch. "You weren't here." She stood in the yard for 1 second, just one, with the document in her hand, and the last of the evening light on her face, and the feeling of being valued moving through her chest, like something she hadn't known she'd been waiting for. Then she followed him inside. Because the fight wasn't over yet. Greer still had 9 days, Reeves would still come, and the survey markers still needed to be located and verified before anything was won. But for one moment, standing in the yards of a ranch she had poured herself into for weeks, with a man who had made supper because she wasn't there to make it, she let herself feel that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Just for one moment. Then she went inside and picked up her fork. They found the first marker the next morning. Wyatt had been out before dawn with a copy of the boundary description Lillian had transcribed, reading it against the land, the way a man reads a letter he has memorized, but wants to hold again anyway. She was with him moving through this property in the early gray light, and when he stopped near the creek bend and crouched down and pushed aside a thick growth of grass at the base of an old post, she felt the held breath of the moment before he said anything. "There," he said. She crouched beside him. The marker was iron-driven deep, with the county seal still legible on its face, despite a decade of weather and overgrowth. She pulled her transcription from her coat pocket and checked the description against what they were looking at. "Creek Bend is 15 yards north," she said. "The description says the marker sits at the base of the bank 15 yards south of the first significant bend." She looked at the creek. She looked at the marker. "This is it." Wyatt straightened and stood for a moment without speaking. "He knew," he said, not with heat. With the quiet, flat certainty of a man arriving at a conclusion he'd suspected for a long time. "Greer knew these markers existed. He was counting on nobody finding them." "I was counting on you not having documentation," she said. "And on the markers being buried deep enough that without the original survey description, they'd be nearly impossible to locate." She folded the transcription carefully. "He didn't count on Cheyenne." "No," Wyatt said. "He didn't." They spent the rest of the morning locating the remaining 3 markers. All 4 were where the 1871 survey said they would be. All 4 placed the eastern boundary exactly where the Callahan fence currently stood, 200 yards east of where Greer's claim would have moved it. Lillian documented each one with precise written notes, the location, the condition, the description from the original survey alongside what they found. By noon, she had a complete record. She was sitting on this porch writing the final summary when Tommy came riding in fast from the direction of town, his horse kicking up dust, and even from a distance she could see by the way he was riding that it wasn't a social call. He pulled up hard in the yard and looked at Wyatt, who had come out of the barn. "Mr. Callahan," Tommy said, catching his breath. "Mr. Reeves moved the survey up. He's coming out day after tomorrow instead of 9 days from now. My pa heard it at the mill this morning." He paused. "People are saying Greer pushed for it. Said he wanted it done before you had time to prepare." Wyatt turned and looked at Lillian. She was already standing. "Day after tomorrow," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Tommy said. She looked at Wyatt. "Then we move today." She held up the folder. "We take this to Reeves directly before he comes out. We don't wait for him to arrive with Greer's version of events already in his head. We get to him first." Wyatt was quiet for half a second. "Where does Reeves stay when he's in Red Hollow?" he said, looking at Tommy. "Mrs. Alderman's boarding house," Tommy said. "Same as always." Wyatt looked at Lillian. "Give me 10 minutes to get cleaned up. I'll get the wagon," she said. Thomas Reeves opened the door of his room at Mrs. Alderman's boarding house to find Wyatt Callahan and Lillian Harper standing in the hallway with a folder of documents and the particular combined energy of two people who have decided that something is going to happen today. To his credit, he stepped back and let them in. Lillian laid the documentation on the small writing table without preamble. The original survey description. The transcribed copy from the Cheyenne Land Office. Her field notes from the morning with each marker described and located with exactness. A brief written summary, tying everything together in language that left no room for ambiguity. Reeves read it. He read it the way Fitch had read her financial summary, with the initial skepticism of a professional who does not expect to be handed something competent by the person standing in front of him, and then with the slower, more careful attention of someone who has discovered that the document in his hands is going to complicate his day considerably. "These markers are verified," he said. "Located this morning," she said. "All 4. The positions match the 1871 survey description precisely. I can provide a signed affidavit if required. The original survey document is filed with the County Land Office in Cheyenne," she said. "I have the document number and the clerk's name who retrieved it. He can be contacted for verification." Reeves set the papers down. He looked at Wyatt. He looked at Lillian. "Mr. Greer's claim rests on the argument that the original markers were incorrectly placed," Reeves said carefully. "And if the markers are present and verifiable," Lillian said, "that argument has no foundation." Reeves was quiet. "I'll need to verify the markers myself," he said. "That's standard." "We expected that," she said. "We'll take you out tomorrow morning. All 4 markers, all 4 descriptions. You'll have everything you need to complete your assessment." He looked at her for a long moment. "Miss Harper," he said, "you prepared all of this since—" "Since I returned from Cheyenne 4 days ago," she said. "Yes." "You rode to Cheyenne and back yourself." "I did." He looked at the documents again. Then he looked at Wyatt. "Mr. Callahan, you are fortunate in your choice of operations manager." Wyatt said, "I know." He said it the way he said everything that mattered without decoration, looking directly at her. She looked back at him. She said nothing because nothing needed to be said. They walked Reeves through the property the following morning, and he verified all 4 markers with the methodical thoroughness of a man who knew he was producing a document that was going to matter. He measured. He noted. He checked each marker against the 1871 description 3 times. He was professional and careful and gave nothing away about his conclusions, but she had learned to read rooms and silences and the particular quality of a careful man's attention, and by the time they reached the 4th marker, she was fairly certain she knew which way the assessment would go. Greer arrived while they were at the 3rd marker. He came across the boundary line on horseback with one of his hands behind him, and he had the air of a man who had expected this morning to go differently and was recalibrating quickly. He looked at Reeves. He looked at the documents Reeves was holding. He looked at Lillian. "Reeves," he said, "I'd like a word." "You're welcome to observe the assessment, Mr. Greer," Reeves said without looking up from his notes. "I'm not in a position to have private words during an official survey." Greer's horse shifted under him. "Where did those documents come from?" he said. His eyes were on Lillian. "The County Land Office," she said. "Cheyenne. The original 1871 survey is on file there, and has been since James Callahan filed the deed. Greer looked at her, the way he had looked at her in the general store, and she held his gaze with the same directness she'd held it then, and the difference was that this time he looked away first. "You rode to Cheyenne," he said. It wasn't a question. "I did," she said. A muscle in his jaw moved. He was a man who had built a strategy on a very specific prediction of what the people around him would and wouldn't do, and the prediction had been wrong in a way he hadn't prepared for. "This isn't over," he said. He said it to Wyatt rather than to her, which she noted. "It is where the boundary is concerned," Wyatt said. Greer pulled his horse around and left. His hand followed him without a word. Reeves watched them go. Then he went back to his notes. "Fourth marker," he said. "Shall we?" The assessment was filed with the county 3 days later. Lillian read the summary when Wyatt brought it back from town. Reeves had ridden to the county seat directly and sent a copy back with the stage. The conclusion was what she had expected: all 4 markers verified positions, consistent with the 1871 survey, no basis found for the boundary dispute claim. Greer's filing had been officially dismissed. She read it once, put it in the file with the rest of the documentation, and went back to the accounts she'd been working on. Wyatt stood in the doorway watching her. "That's it," he said. She looked up. "The boundary question is settled. What else would there be?" "Most people would." He stopped. "Would what?" "Celebrate," he said. "You just killed a land claim that would have taken a third of the east pasture." "I know what I did," she said. "The cattle still need to be checked, and the September accounts won't balance themselves." She looked at him directly. "We can celebrate when the banknote is paid off, and Greer has tried everything he's going to try and given up. Not before." He leaned against the doorframe and looked at her with that expression she'd learned over months of mornings and evenings and hard days, the one that had started as assessment and become something else entirely. "You never stop," he said. "No," she said. "I don't." "Why not?" She looked at him for a moment. It was an honest question asked simply, and she gave it an honest answer. "Because I spent a long time being told I didn't have anything worth stopping for," she said. "So when I find something worth fighting for, I don't know how to do it halfway." The room was very quiet. "Lillian," he said. She went still. He used her given name rarely. Each time he did it, landed differently than she expected. "This ranch," he said slowly, "is worth fighting for because of what you've made it." He paused. "I want you to know that I understand the difference between where it was before you came and where it is now. I'm not a man who says things he doesn't mean, and I'm telling you plainly, this place is still standing because of you." She looked at the desk. She looked at the folder. She looked at her own hands. "It's still standing because we didn't give up on it," she said. "That includes you. It's your land. You held it for 3 years alone. All I did was—" "Don't do that," he said quietly. She looked up. "Don't make yourself smaller than you are," he said. "I've watched you do it once or twice when you think I'm not paying attention. You work harder than anyone I've known, and then you hand the credit back before anyone can give it to you properly." His voice was even, but there was something in it she hadn't heard before, something that had been building for a long time and was very close to the surface now. "I'm paying attention. I've been paying attention since the day you walked in here and told me you'd worked harder than the people who judged you." He held her gaze. "You were right, and you've been proving it every day since." She was very still. She had received very few things in her life that had been given without condition, without the small tax of someone wanting something back. She had learned to be careful with what felt like generosity, because it so often came with a price she discovered too late. But this was Wyatt, who said what he meant and meant what he said, and whose letter she had read 3 times before she packed her bag in Cheyenne. "Thank you," she said. And then, because she was who she was, "That matters more than I know how to say properly." "You don't have to say it properly," he said. "You just have to hear it." She nodded. "I hear it," she said. He straightened from the doorframe. "Supper in an hour," he said. "I'm making it again." She blinked. "You don't have to." "I know I don't," he said, and walked out. She sat at the desk for 1 full minute without moving. Then she picked up her pen and went back to the September accounts, and she was smiling in a way she was very glad no one was there to see. But Greer had one move left. She should have expected it. She had told herself she did expect it, that a man like Greer didn't accept dismissal quietly, that the boundary claim failing would not be the end of it, that they needed to be ready. She had been ready for another attack on the fence, another attempt to move the cattle, another approach through a third party like Mrs. Hatch. She had not been ready for what he actually did. He went to the bank, not Fitch, who had extended their note and would have known the property numbers. He went above Fitch to the bank's parent office in Laramie, and he filed a competing investment claim, a formal document stating that he was prepared to purchase the Callahan property at fair value, and that the current operation was insufficiently viable to carry the outstanding debt. They found out from Fitch himself, who rode out on a Thursday morning looking genuinely uncomfortable and handed Wyatt a letter before he'd gotten off his horse. Wyatt read it. His face did the thing it did when something was wrong, that controlled flatness, everything locked down. He handed it to Lillian without a word. She read it standing in the yard, and the feeling that moved through her was not panic. It was something colder and more focused than panic. The competing claim put the bank in a position where they were obligated to consider the offer. It didn't automatically void the existing note extension, but it gave the Laramie office the opening to reconsider the extension entirely if they decided Greer's offer represented a better outcome for the bank. The response window was 2 weeks. "What does the bank need to see?" she said to Fitch directly. Fitch looked at her. He had the expression of a man who had stopped being surprised that she was the person asking the questions and had moved on to simply answering them. "They need evidence that the operation is viable for the duration of the loan," he said. "Current and projected numbers. An argument that the note will be repaid as scheduled." He paused. "A competing offer is a significant document, Miss Harper. The Laramie office doesn't know this property. They'll weigh the numbers against Greer's offer on paper." "Then we give them better numbers," she said. "You have 2 weeks." "I know," she said. Fitch tipped his hat and rode out. She turned to Wyatt. "The fall cattle count," she said. "When were you planning to drive them to market?" "First week of October," he said. "Can we move it up?" He looked at her. "How far up?" 3 weeks from now," he thought. She watched him calculate the state of the herd, the weight of the cattle, the distance to the market town, the practicalities of organizing a drive with a reduced crew. "It'd be close," he said. "The cattle could use another 2 weeks on the slope pasture." "They've had 6 weeks," she said. "They're in better condition than they've been in 2 years. You told me that yourself." She held his gaze. "If we complete the drive in 3 weeks and have the sale numbers in hand when we respond to the Laramie office, we have real proof the note will be repaid. Not projections, actual proceeds." He looked at the horizon. She could see him working through it. "I'll need help with the drive," he said. "I can't do it with just us." "Tommy's father," she said. "Could he spare 2 days?" "Maybe." "Anyone else?" Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There's a man, Pete Alderman. He worked the drives with me before my brother left. He's been at the Henderson place for 2 years, but Henderson's drive was last month. He might be available." "Will he come if you ask?" Wyatt looked at her. "He'll come if I ask." "Then ask him today," she said. "I'll start on the response document for the bank tonight." He turned toward his horse. "Wyatt," she said. He stopped. "We're going to save this ranch," she said, not as a question. He turned and looked at her over his shoulder. Something in his face that had been guarded for as long as she'd known him had come open in the last hour, cracked clear through by the accumulated weight of everything they had fought through side by side. "I know," he said. "I stopped doubting that a while ago." She looked at him. "When?" she said. I was quiet for a moment. Then, "The morning I found you in the barn with that calf, sitting on the floor in the hay at 5 in the morning, keeping it alive because it mattered and because you were there and you could." He held her gaze. "That was when." She stood in the yard with the letter in her hand and the Wyoming wind moving around her, and the feeling of the ground solid under her feet. And she thought about every town she had walked through with her chin up and her jaw set, and the weight of everyone's opinions pressing down on her shoulders. And she thought about this ranch, and this man, and what the two of them had built in the months since a stagecoach stopped in Red Hollow. "Go ask Pete Alderman," she said quietly. He nodded once and went. She went inside and opened the accounts ledger and began building the case that would save everything they had made. The drive was brutal, and it was exactly what she'd promised herself. It would be 3 weeks hard. Miles, the particular relentless work of moving cattle to market with a crew of 4 people, and no margin for error. She stayed at the ranch and managed the documentation, the correspondence with the Laramie Bank office, and the daily operation of the property in Wyatt's absence. She also did something she had not planned to do. She wrote to Mrs. Hatch. On Thursday, Peters from the general store arrived at the ranch with a sealed envelope and the slightly amazed expression of a man who has discovered something surprising about himself. "There are 11 letters," he said, handing her the envelope. "I helped some of them with the writing. Mrs. Hatch organized it." He paused. "She came to the store Monday evening and said you needed something from the town, and that she thought it was past time the town decided what kind of neighbors we were going to be." He looked slightly uncomfortable. She mentioned she'd been used as a vehicle for other people's interests, and that she didn't intend to allow it again. Lillian held the envelope. 11 letters, she said. "From 11 different people in Red Hollow," Peters said. "All addressed to the Laramie office. All saying they've seen the changes at Callahan Ranch and they believe in the operation." He paused again. Mrs. Hatch wrote the longest one. Lillian stood in the doorway of the ranch house with 11 letters from the town that had laughed at her on the day she arrived, written on her behalf, organized by the woman who had laughed loudest. She thought about her mother's Bible on the edge of the bed in the south room. She thought about $37 and a bag of clothes and an advertisement that said no romantics required. She thought about all the things she had decided to believe about herself in the years when no one else would. "Thank you, Mr. Peters," she said, and her voice was entirely steady. "Ma'am," he said, and tipped his hat and left. She added the letters to the file she was sending to Laramie. She sealed the package. She sent it with the next stage. Then she sat down at the kitchen table alone in the ranch house, and she allowed herself exactly 2 minutes of something she had not allowed herself in a very long time. She put her face in her hands, and she let the tears come quietly and privately. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming and unfamiliar feeling of being seen. 2 minutes. No more. Then she washed her face, put the kettle on, and went back to work. Wyatt came back from the drive on a Wednesday evening 12 days after he'd left. She heard the horses in the yard and came to the door, and he was coming off his horse with the bone-deep exhaustion of a man who had pushed himself past the reasonable limit and known it and kept going anyway. Pete Alderman and Tommy's father came in behind him, and she had water and food ready for all of them, and she let the logistics of the return fill the first half hour before she said anything about what mattered. After Pete and Tommy's father had gone, and it was just them in the kitchen, she put the sale figures in front of him. He looked at them. He looked at them for a long time. "That's enough," he said slowly. "More than enough," she said. "The summer weight gain put the herd well above the average market weight for the county. You got a premium price." She pointed to the figure on the second page. "That's what goes to the bank. What's left covers the outstanding supplier debts and leaves a working reserve going into winter." He was very quiet. "The note," he said. "Paid in full," she said. "Or it will be once we bring these figures to Fitch." He set the paper down. She watched him. She had watched him for months, now had learned his face the way you learn a landscape. You walk through every day until it becomes part of how you understand the world. And she knew this moment for what it was. The moment when a man who has been holding on with both hands for a very long time feels the thing he's been holding stop pulling away. "The Laramie office," he said. "Greer's claim. I sent our response package 10 days ago," she said. "The sale figures weren't included. I didn't have them yet, but I included the boundary documentation, the herd improvement numbers, the bank extension records, and—" She paused. 11 letters from Red Hollow. He looked up sharply. 11 letters, he said. From 11 residents attesting to the viability of the operation and the value of keeping the property in your family. She held his gaze. Mrs. Hatch organized it. He stared at her. Mrs. Hatch, he said. It turns out she doesn't enjoy being used as a lever, Lillian said. Once she understood that's what was happening, she made a different decision. She paused. I asked her to. I wrote to her while you were gone. You wrote to Dora Hatch, he said slowly. I wrote to the town through her, Lillian said. She was the right person to organize it. She has standing in Red Hollow. She knows everyone. Once she decided to move in our direction, she brought people with her. Wyatt was looking at her, the way he'd looked at her the first morning in the barn, with something that had started as surprise and become too large for that word. Lillian, he said. She waited. I don't know what to... He stopped. He looked at the table. He looked at his hands. He was a man of very few words, and she had always known that and respected it. But she could see him struggling now with the particular inadequacy of having few words for a moment that required many. You don't have to say it, she said gently. I want to, he said. He looked up. I need to say that I... He stopped again. She held very still. I didn't hire you because I thought you'd save this ranch, he said. I hired you because I needed help, and you wrote the clearest letter I'd ever read. He held her gaze. But I want you to know that every day since you got here, I have found it. Wyatt? She said softly. He looked at her. Say the simple thing, she said. You're better at the simple things than you think. He breathed. I don't want you to leave, he said. Not because of the ranch, because of... He stopped. Because of you. The kitchen was entirely quiet. She looked at him, this man who had been alone for 3 years and had written a letter that said, no romantics required, because he had given up on believing anyone would see past the work and the land and the difficulty to the person underneath. She had seen the person underneath from the first week. I'm not going anywhere, she said. I'm not asking you to stay as an employee, he said. I want to be clear about that. I know, she said. I'm asking... He stopped. He looked at her hands on the table. He looked at her face. I'm not good at this. You're doing fine, she said. I'm asking if you'd consider... He stopped one more time, and then with the same directness he brought to everything that mattered, he said, Lillian Harper, I am asking if you would consider making this your ranch too, in every sense of the word. She looked at him. She thought about the stagecoach, the women on the porch, the $37, the barn at 5 in the morning, the 4-day ride to Cheyenne and back, the 11 letters, the calves, the accounts, the fence, all of it. She thought about a man who had read her letter 3 times. Yes, she said. Simple, direct. The way things that matter deserve to be said. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and they sat like that in the kitchen of the ranch. They had fought for together, and neither of them said anything else for a while because there was nothing else that needed to be said tonight. Outside the window, the Wyoming stars came out one by one over the land that was theirs. The letter from the Laramie office arrived on a Monday. Lillian was at the desk when Wyatt brought it in from town, and she knew from the way he set it down in front of her carefully without drama, the way he handled things, he didn't yet know the weight of that. He hadn't opened it on the ride back. He'd waited. She understood that he'd waited for her, and she didn't say anything about it, just picked it up and broke the seal. She read it once through. She read it again. Greer's claim has been dismissed, she said. The Laramie office reviewed the boundary documentation and the character letters and the sale figures and found no basis for overriding the existing note terms. She set the letter on the desk and looked at him. The note stands. The property is clear. Wyatt stood across from her and said nothing for a moment. It's done, he said. It's done, she said. He looked at the letter. He looked at her. And then he did something she had seen him do perhaps 3 times. In all the months since she'd arrived, he sat down. Not because there was work to do, sitting down, but because he needed to. He sat down and put his elbows on the desk and his face briefly in his hands, and she recognized that posture. She had worn it herself. It was the posture of someone who has been holding something up for so long that when it finally doesn't need holding anymore, the body doesn't quite know what to do with itself. She let him have the moment. She looked at the window and gave him 30 seconds of privacy while he found his footing again. Then he raised his head and said, "Pete Alderman asked me last week if I'd need extra hands for next spring's drive." She turned and looked at him. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I'd let him know." He held her gaze. "I think the answer is yes." She understood what he was saying. Next spring's drive would be bigger, because next spring's herd would be larger, because they were going to grow this ranch, not just save it, but grow it, and he was already thinking about what that looked like. She was already thinking about it too. "We should expand the north pasture before winter," she said. "If we clear the brush along the creek line and extend the fence line another 100 yards, we can carry 12 more head through the season." "I was thinking the same thing," he said. "I know," she said. "I saw you looking at that section of the creek last week." He almost smiled. "You watch me too closely." "Someone has to," she said. "You don't watch yourself closely enough." He did smile. Then the real one. The brief and unguarded one she had been watching develop over months, the way you watch something grow slow and certain and worth every day of waiting. They sat together at the desk, with the dismissed letter between them, and talked about next spring for an hour, and it was the most ordinary and the most extraordinary hour she could remember. She told him about her answer that same week. Not the yes she'd given him in the kitchen that had been its own complete thing, simple and clean and requiring no elaboration, but the fuller version. The one she hadn't given anyone, because there hadn't been anyone to give it to. They were on the porch after supper, the evening cooling down from the day's heat, and he had asked her quietly, as he asked everything, whether she ever thought about what her life would have looked like if she hadn't answered the advertisement. She was quiet for a moment. "I think about what it looked like before," she said. "I don't think much about the alternate version." "What did it look like before?" She looked at the ridge line in the distance. "Small," she said. "Not because my life was small. I worked hard. I managed. I found ways to be useful. But it felt small, like I was always on the edge of something never quite inside it." She paused. "People have been telling me since I was a girl that I wasn't what they were looking for. That I was too much in some ways and not enough in others. That the things they wanted in a woman and the things I was simply didn't match up." She turned and looked at him. "You never said that." "No," he said. "Not once," she said. "Not even on the first day when you had every reason to look at me the way the rest of them did." "I wasn't looking for what they were looking for," he said. "What were you looking for?" He thought about it. Wyatt was not a man who answered questions before he'd worked through them. "Someone who would look at what I had," he said, "and tell me the truth about it. Not what I wanted to hear. Not a version softened for my benefit." He paused. "I'd had enough of managing alone and not knowing if I was managing well or just managing. I needed someone to look at it clearly and tell me what was real." "That's a rare thing to want," she said. "You're a rare thing to find," he said. She looked at him. He said it the way he said everything that came from somewhere deep, plainly without performance, as a simple fact. He was reporting because it was true. "I'm not rare," she said. "I'm ordinary. I'm exactly who you'd have found if more people had bothered to look." "Maybe," he said. "But they didn't, and I did." She turned back to the ridgeline. "Yes," she said quietly. "You did." They sat on the porch until the stars were fully out, and neither of them felt any need to fill the dark with words. The wedding was in November, 3 weeks after the first frost. It was not large. Lillian had not wanted large, had in fact been clear about this in the same direct way she was clear about everything. She wanted the pastor from Red Hollow, and she wanted Tommy as a witness, because Tommy had been the first person in Red Hollow to look at her and simply see a person, and she wanted it to happen on the ranch, because the ranch was where they had become who they were to each other. Wyatt had agreed to all of it without argument, and had added only one thing. "Pete's coming," he said, "and his wife. They've been friends since before my brother left, and I'm not doing this without him there." "Then Pete's coming," she said. Mrs. Hatch came too. Though no one had exactly invited her, she simply appeared on the morning in question, in her good dress, with a covered dish, and Lillian opened the door and looked at her and stepped back to let her in. "I brought a cake," Mrs. Hatch said. "Thank you, ma'am," Lillian said. Mrs. Hatch looked at her for a moment. "You look lovely," she said. It came out like something she'd been deciding whether to say, and had decided. Lillian was wearing her best dress, blue wool high collar, the one she'd packed in Cheyenne, with no idea what she'd ever find to wear it for. Her chestnut hair was down for the occasion, pulled partly back with a ribbon loose, in a way she almost never allowed herself. "Thank you," she said simply. "I owe you an apology," Mrs. Hatch said, "for the things I said on the day you arrived." "You don't." "I do," Mrs. Hatch said firmly. "I looked at you and decided I knew what you were before you'd said a word or done a single thing. That was wrong, and I've known it was wrong for longer than I've been willing to say so." She straightened. "I'm saying so now." Lillian looked at her. "I accept your apology," she said, "and I'm glad you came." Mrs. Hatch nodded once, precisely the way of a woman who has settled an account and is ready to move forward. "Now, where would you like the cake?" The ceremony was 20 minutes long. Pastor Hill said the words, and Wyatt said the words, and Lillian said the words, and when it was done, Wyatt took her hand with the same unceremonious directness he brought to everything and held it, and Tommy cheered with the full enthusiasm of a 13-year-old who had decided months ago that this was exactly what should happen, and was very pleased to be proven right. Pete Alderman shook Wyatt's hand and said something low that made Wyatt's jaw move in the way it did when he was keeping a strong feeling contained, and Pete's wife embraced Lillian and said, "We have heard so much about you," in a tone that made clear she meant all of it and approved of all of it. Mrs. Hatch cut the cake. Peters from the general store came in the afternoon with his wife and a bottle of good whiskey he said he'd been saving without knowing exactly for what. Tommy stayed until dark and ate 3 pieces of cake and told anyone who would listen that he had known from the moment he drove Lillian in from town that she was different from everyone else they'd ever had come through. Red Hollow, and he said it with such conviction that no one pointed out that he'd been 12 at the time and probably hadn't known any such thing. Late that evening, when everyone had gone and the house was quiet and cleaned and settled, Lillian stood on the porch in the cold November air and looked out at the land. Wyatt came out and stood beside her. He put his coat around her shoulders without asking if she was cold because he could see that she was. "All right," he said. "Better than all right," she said. "What are you thinking about?" She was quiet for a moment. "The day I arrived," she said. "I stood in the middle of that street with my bags and the whole town looking at me, and I thought, I just have to get through today. Just today. And then tomorrow, I'll figure out tomorrow." She paused. "I didn't let myself think further than that, because I'd been disappointed enough times that thinking further felt like something I couldn't afford." I was quiet beside her, listening, the way he always listened, with his full attention, giving her the space to say the whole thing. "I let myself think further now," she said. "How far?" he said. "Pretty far," she said. I took her hand and held it, and they stood on the porch of the Callahan ranch in the November dark, with the cold Wyoming air around them, and the land stretching out below the stars. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything she had not let herself want for a very long time. The winter was hard, the way Wyoming winters always were, and they went through it together, the way they went through everything, working alongside each other, dividing the labor without ceremony, talking through the problems as they came. Lillian learned things she hadn't known. Wyatt learned things he hadn't known. That was the nature of it. Two people who had been managing alone, discovering that management was different when it was shared, that the things you'd been carrying single-handed were lighter, with 2 sets of hands, that problems you'd solved by grinding away at them alone could sometimes be solved faster by simply turning to the person next to you and saying, "Here's what I'm thinking. What do you see?" She had never had anyone to ask that of before. She hadn't understood what she was missing until she had it. He had never had anyone who asked him and meant it and then actually listened to the answer. He hadn't understood it either. They figured it out together slowly and practically, and without making a great romantic event of it, because that was who they both were. In February, a letter came from Wyatt's brother Daniel in Montana. Wyatt read it at the kitchen table and was quiet for a long time after. "He wants to come back," he said. Lillian looked up from the accounts. "To Red Hollow. He's been working a ranch outside Billings for 2 years. The owner died in November and the property's being sold off." He set the letter down. "He says he made a mistake leaving. He says he'd come back if there was a place for him." She looked at him carefully. "Is there?" He looked at her. "This is your ranch too. That's not a question I answer alone anymore." She thought about it. She thought about what she knew of Daniel, from the things Wyatt had told her a younger brother. A disagreement about the future of the ranch 3 years ago, a departure that had left Wyatt more alone than he'd admitted to himself. She thought about what it had cost Wyatt to manage alone for 3 years. She thought about what an extra pair of capable hands could mean for what they were trying to build. "Write him back," she said. "Tell him there's a place." Wyatt looked at her for a moment. "You're sure?" he said. "He's your family," she said simply. "And this ranch is going to need more hands if we grow it the way we're planning." She held his gaze. "Write to him." He wrote that evening. Daniel Callahan arrived in April. He was younger than she'd pictured, 32, with the same dark hair as Wyatt, and the same blue eyes but deployed differently, in a face that was more open and quicker to move. He shook her hand when they met in the yard and said, "Wyatt wrote me about you," and left it at that, and she decided in the first 30 seconds that she liked him. The first week was an adjustment. It was always an adjustment when the structure of a household changed, and she had learned enough about herself to know that she needed to be deliberate about making room rather than managing around a new presence. She was deliberate. He was willing. Wyatt watched the two of them navigate each other with the quiet attention of a man who had been worrying about this particular meeting since he wrote the letter inviting it. On the 4th evening, Daniel came into the kitchen while she was doing the accounts and said without preamble, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes," she said. "How bad was it when you got here?" She looked at him. He was asking honestly, not to criticize, not to make a point, just to understand. "The ranch was 9 months from losing the banknote," she said. "The herd was down a third. The accounts were losing $12 a month. The east fence was broken, and the slope pasture inaccessible." She paused. "Your brother was working himself to death trying to hold it alone." Daniel was quiet. "I should have come back sooner," he said. "Yes," she said. "But you're here now." He looked at her. "He wouldn't have asked me to come if it weren't for you." "He might have eventually," she said. "No." Daniel shook his head. "I know my brother. He'd have kept going alone until he couldn't anymore. He doesn't ask for things." He paused. "You changed that." She thought about that. "I think he was ready to change it," she said. "He just needed someone to ask him to." Daniel nodded slowly. He looked at the accounts spread on the desk. "You really do run the operation." "We both run it," she said. "Sure," he said in a tone that suggested he was reserving his full agreement on this point. "But the accounts, the documentation, the bank, that was you. And the cattle and the land and the decisions that kept the herd alive through the drought was him," she said firmly. "We each do what we're suited for. That's the arrangement." He looked at her for a moment. "I think my brother found something better than he deserved," he said. "Don't tell him that," she said. "He'll argue about it for an hour." Daniel laughed a genuine surprised laugh, and she decided she more than liked him. Spring came and the work expanded with it. The north pasture extension she and Wyatt had planned through the winter was completed in March 12. Additional head-carrying capacity, just as she'd calculated. The creek line clearing had gone smoother than expected, because Daniel turned out to have a particular talent for that kind of work, methodical and thorough in the way of someone who finds satisfaction in a thing done completely right. The herd went into spring in the best condition it had been since before the drought years. She documented everything as she documented everything, building the record that would tell the story of the ranch's recovery in numbers that could not be argued with. In April, Fitch from the bank came out for what he called a routine check-in. She was ready for him, as she was always ready, with a summary document and current figures, and projected outcomes through the fall. He read it at the kitchen table with his coffee and his clerk beside him, and the particular expression she had learned to recognize as the face of a man who expects to be pleasantly surprised and is. "Miss Harper," he said, and then corrected himself. "Mrs. Callahan. The improvement since last summer, is it significant?" "We've had good conditions," she said, "and good decisions. The expanded pasture increases carrying capacity by 18% over last year," she said. "The projected fall sale numbers are on page 3. He turned to page 3. He looked at the numbers. He looked at her. "At this rate," he said, "you'll have the remaining note balance cleared in 18 months. 12, she said, "if the fall prices hold where they've been running." He looked at her for a long moment. "You know," he said, "when I came out here last summer and met you for the first time, He stopped. "You didn't expect this," she said pleasantly. "I didn't expect you," he said honestly. "I apologize for that." "No need," she said, "as long as you see it clearly now." "I see it clearly," he said. Wyatt, sitting at the end of the table, said nothing. But she felt him the particular quality of his attention when he was quietly pleased about something, and that was enough. The real change in Red Hollow came gradually, the way real changes always do, not in a single moment, but in the accumulation of small moments that shifted something in the air. Mrs. Hatch had been the first, but she hadn't been the last. Peter's wife began stopping by the ranch occasionally, ostensibly, to return something borrowed or deliver something ordered in reality, to talk, and Lillian talked with her directly and warmly, and word of that got back to other women in the town the way words always did. She went to town now, and the silence that fell when she walked in was a different kind. Not the silence of dismissal, the silence of attention, of a person being recognized. She did not make too much of it. She was not interested in the approval of Red Hollow as a prize to be won. But she was honest enough to acknowledge that it felt different, that walking into Peter's store and having him call her Mrs. Callahan and set aside the items she usually ordered without being asked was a different experience from the whispers and the sideways looks and the covered mouths of the previous summer. She did not forgive the town its first reactions easily or sentimentally. She forgave it practically. They had been wrong. They had adjusted. She was willing to move forward. That was enough. Greer was the last piece. She had wondered about him through the winter, whether he would find another angle, another approach, another way to apply pressure. He was not a man who accepted defeat without it changing him in some way, and she'd kept one eye on the county records and one ear open for news from town, just in case. What she hadn't expected was the conversation that happened in May. She was in the general store when he came in. She saw him before he saw her, and she made no move to leave or avoid him. She had never avoided a difficult thing in her life, and she wasn't going to start now. He saw her. He stopped. The store went quiet in the particular way that small towns go quiet when they recognize the potential for something. He walked toward her. She waited. He stopped at a reasonable distance and looked at her, and there was something in his face she hadn't seen before in all her dealings with him. Not warmth. She wasn't foolish enough to expect warmth, but something that might have been a reluctant form of reckoning. "Mrs. Callahan," he said. "Mr. Greer," she said. A pause. "I heard the notes nearly cleared," he said. "That's right," she said. Another pause. "The boundary claim," he said. "I want you to know that I acted on what I believed was a legitimate dispute." She looked at him steadily. "And the fence," she said. "And the cattle." His jaw moved. "I hired men I didn't oversee closely enough," he said. "That's all I'll say about it." It was not an apology. It was not quite an admission. But it was a man who had decided for reasons of his own that this particular war had run its course. "Then we understand each other," she said. "I think we do," he said. He tipped his hat. She inclined her head. He walked to the counter. She finished her business and left, and she did not think too hard about what had changed in Greer or why. Men like him changed when it stopped being profitable not to. That was enough. Tommy was waiting with the wagon outside. "Was that Greer?" he said wide-eyed. "It was," she said, climbing up. What did he say? Not much, she said. Drive please, Tommy. He drove. After a moment he said, You know I told my pa months ago that you were going to win. Did you? He said I was too optimistic. Tommy squared his shoulders with the dignity of someone who has been vindicated. I told him I'd met you, and that was reason enough. She looked at him sideways. He was 14 now, taller, the gap-toothed grin the same as it had ever been. Tommy, she said, when you're grown and you find yourself in a difficult situation, I want you to remember one thing. What's that, ma'am? The people who underestimate you are not doing you a disservice, she said. They're just giving you room to surprise them. He thought about that for most of the drive home. The second summer was nothing like the first. The herd was larger and healthier. The accounts were clean. The debt was shrinking. Daniel had settled into the ranch's rhythms, like someone returning to a language he'd almost forgotten. Haltingly at first, then fluently, and then as though he'd never been away. Wyatt was different too, not transformed, not soft, nothing like that. But easier inside himself. Like a man who had put down something heavy and discovered his arms still worked. She was different too. She hadn't expected that, had not thought that she would change, having been so certain of herself for so long out of necessity. But she had. She had loosened in some way she couldn't name exactly, some held-back quality she'd maintained so long against the cold of not being wanted that she hadn't noticed it was still there even after the cold had gone. She let herself be seen more. She let herself take up the space she actually occupied without bracing against the comment she expected, and that didn't come. She let herself be happy. That was the one she hadn't expected most. On a Thursday evening in August, Wyatt came in from the north pasture with a look on his face that she had not seen before, and she turned from what she was doing and waited. Come out here, he said. She followed him out to the porch. He pointed. She looked. The north pasture stretched out before them in the late summer light, the grass thick and green from the creek extension and the better management of the past year. The herd was visible from the porch, larger than it had been, well fed, moving slowly through the good grass. The slope pasture beyond was green from here to the ridge. The east fence line was intact and solid. The bunkhouse Daniel had repaired in the spring stood clean and straight. Look at it, he said. She looked. When I came out here last August, he said, there were 12 fewer head in that pasture. The creek line was dry. The south fence was down in 2 places. He paused. I didn't tell you this at the time, but there were 3 mornings that summer before you arrived when I sat on this porch and thought about selling. She turned and looked at him. You never said that, she said. No, he said. I didn't. What stopped you? He looked at her with the directness that she had loved about him, from the first honest letter, from the first morning in the barn, from every plain and unadorned thing he had ever said to her. Stubbornness mostly, he said. And then you arrived. Stubbornness got you through until I arrived, she said. That's not nothing. No, he said. But it wasn't enough either. He turned and looked at the land again. You were the difference between holding on and going forward. Those are 2 different things. She looked out at the pasture. She thought about what it meant to have made something not alone, not through some exceptional and solitary act of will, but alongside another person in the particular and unglamorous way that things that last are actually built. I want to expand the south herd next spring, she said. He looked at her. I've been running the numbers, she said. If we improve the drainage on the south pasture this fall, there's a grade issue I've been watching. We can bring that section back to productivity. Combined with the north extension, we'll have enough carrying capacity to run a 3rd larger herd by next summer. She looked at him. The fall sale prices are holding high. If we invest the surplus now instead of banking it, Lillian, he said. She stopped. I know, he said. I've been looking at the same numbers. She blinked. I was going to bring it to you this week, he said. The drainage issue on the south slope. And the herd expansion. He was almost smiling. We think the same way about this land. She looked at him. We've been thinking in the same direction for a year, she said. I don't know why that should still surprise me." "It shouldn't," he said. She turned back to the pasture. "The largest ranch in the territory," she said quietly. Not a boast. A statement of intention, the kind she'd been making to herself her entire life, in rooms where no one thought she was capable of the things she was planning. "Give it 5 years," he said. 3, she said. He laughed. A real one, full and easy, the kind she had spent a year earning and never got tired of hearing. 3, he agreed. All right. They stood on the porch of the ranch that had been dying when she arrived, and was alive now, fully productively, undeniably alive, and she felt the weight of everything it had taken to get here. Every hard morning, every difficult conversation, every mile to Cheyenne and back, every account balanced, and every fence repaired, and every moment she had chosen to keep going when going was the harder choice. She had spent 24 years being told in 100 different ways that she was not quite what the world was looking for. She looked out at the land that bore her name now alongside his, at the herd that was fat and healthy, on the slope pasture that everyone had said couldn't be recovered, at the life she had built with her own hands and her own mind, alongside a man who had been smart enough and honest enough to see her clearly from the very first day. Wyatt put his arm around her. She leaned into him exactly as much as she wanted to, which was completely. "You know what Tommy said to me last week," she said. "What? He said he's going to work this ranch when he's grown." She paused. "He said he told his father that this is going to be the most important ranch in Wyoming someday, and he wants to be part of it from the beginning." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "He's not wrong," he said. "No," she said. "He's not." The evening was coming down soft and golden over the ridge, and the cattle moved slowly through the grass below them, and somewhere in the barn a horse shifted and settled, and the whole world was quiet. In the way it gets quiet when everything important is exactly where it belongs. She was not the woman everyone in Red Hollow had decided she was on the day she stepped off that stagecoach. She had never been that woman. She was Lillian Callahan, and she had ridden to Cheyenne and back in 4 days, and she had found 4 iron markers buried in Wyoming grass, and she had written 11 letters worth of truth to a town that needed to hear it, and she had looked at a dying ranch and seen what it could become when other people had only seen what it was failing to be. And the man standing beside her on this porch had been wise enough and humble enough and honest enough to say, "Tell me what you see." She had told him, and all of this was what she had seen. "Come on," Wyatt said. "Supper's going to be cold." "You cooked again," she said. "Daniel cooked," he said. "God help us both." She laughed and turned with him to go inside into the warm light of the house that was hers and his and theirs, and behind them the land stretched out long and green and alive under the last light of the Wyoming sun. The woman everyone rejected had not just found a place to belong, she had built one. And it was the largest thing for miles in every direction, and it was only going to grow.